Hello and welcome to the CCP, where the TurboGrafx-16 lives on, and it's always Turbo Time! Boy, I tell you what, things sure have changed for programmer and video game producer Yuji Naka. When I was growing up back in the 80s and 90s, Yuji Naka was universally acclaimed as the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog. Back then, Naka was just a young, brilliant, strikingly handsome visionary who had taught himself how to program computers while he was still in Japanese high school. The guy skipped college for Pete's sake, just like Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Jack Dorsey, and Walt Disney. You know, all the best people. Yuji Naka knew what he wanted from the starting gate, and thus he went straight into the video game industry, transforming childhood ideas and ambitions into a career that would eventually put him on equal footing with Shigeru Miyamoto, at least for a time, because over time, Naka's legacy has begun to decay and crumble. Stories have emerged characterizing Naka as a temperamental prima donna, willing to steal credit and use others for the sake of securing his own future, turning the Sega hero into one of contemporary gaming's most notable bad guys. Perhaps no Yuji Naka's story is as infamous as that told by former Sega producer Mark Subotnick on the Retro Hour podcast in 2021. Subotnick claims that while developing a never-released Dreamcast game called Geist Force, this is Geist Force, it was a Star Fox clone developed by Sega of America as a Dreamcast launch title. It was during the development of this game that Subotnick and his team were visited by Yuji Naka, who at this point in his career had become one of Sega's most important and influential producers. According to Subotnick, Naka was allegedly covetous of the game engine developed for Geist Force. Thus, he proceeded to openly discuss, in Japanese, with his associates, plans to fire most of the Geist Force team and to take the game's technology, as well as one of its engineers, for use in developing a future Sonic the Hedgehog game. Absolutely nefarious, right? However, Subotnick explains, it just so happens that Naka's nefarious plans were overheard by the game's development team. And wouldn't you know it, several of them, including the head engineer himself, happened to speak fluent Japanese. As a consequence, the engineers quit the project and sought work elsewhere, ruining Geist Force's chance to be released. Initially, I found this story hard to believe for two big reasons. First, Subotnick's version of this event clashes with the one told by Geist Force's lead programmer back in the year 2000, when the Dreamcast was still on the store shelves. In issue number 137 of Electronic Gaming Monthly, the December 2000 issue, Geist Force's lead programmer, Nimai Mali, was interviewed for an article about canceled games. In the article, Nimai Mali, who no longer worked at Sega, explained that Geist Force was canceled for a myriad of reasons, including delays caused by several missed deadlines, and political infighting between members of the team. Indeed, even by the time the game was canceled by Sega, who thought the game beneath their expectations, the programming itself was still only 65 to 70% completed. Nimai Mali makes no mention of Yuji Naka or an exodus from Sega caused by Naka's attempt to steal their work. The second reason I doubt Subotnick's story is that I know how exceedingly difficult it is to really learn Japanese. It takes roughly 2,500 hours of study to become proficient in Japanese, which is roughly 4 times as much time as it takes to learn Spanish. Japanese is just an extremely difficult language for English speakers to learn, which is why less than 1% of all Americans can speak the language with any meaningful fluency.
What does katana mean?
It means Japanese sword.
And of this less than 1%, the vast majority are ethnically Japanese people living in Hawaii. Thus, the odds that the Geist Force team would have any fluent Japanese speakers, much less several of them, is just incredibly improbable. Nor do I think it would be likely for a group of game developers to all walk out on a project so late into its development cycle, because in their industry, completed game projects are the standard by which you're measured. Thus, Mark Subotnick's story on the Retro Hour podcast was very hard for me to believe. However, I did a little research on Nimai Mali, Geist Force's lead programmer from both Subotnik's story and the Electronic Gaming Monthly article, and it turns out that he started his career in 1990 working at Hudson Soft in Sapporo, Japan. For him to have worked in Sapporo, Japan for any amount of time strongly implies that Nimai Mali most likely really does speak enough Japanese to interpret the nefarious plans of Yuji Naka, had Naka actually made such a public statement about his intentions to dissolve the Geist Force team and steal their code. It's possible that Yuji Naka really did visit Sega of America to oversee Mark Subotnik's team working on Geist Force, but it's likely that such a visit wasn't casual, friendly curiosity, but rather an investigation by Sega of Japan into a game that had missed multiple deadlines and wasn't nearing completion. Naka may have mentioned the need to dissolve the team, but not as a plot for personal gain, but as a managerial necessity, and if he suggested salvaging or reusing the game engine and retaining some staff who could use it, then that would have been a reasonable plan of action, considering the fact that Sega had invested their own time and money into the project without any marketable results. Thus, it's possible to interpret Yuji Naka's actions here as sound management of company resources in the face of a fruitless project stuck in development hell. That's a positive interpretation anyway, but these days, positive stories about Yuji Naka are few and far between. Today, the prevalent tendency is to bury the man, and this seems to be symptomatic of a larger, less questionable reality. The fact that not many people are left in the world that actually like Yuji Naka. I mean, look at him. Look at that handsome, smug, better than you smile. Who could dislike such a face? Apparently everyone. But if you think Yuji Naka is a jerk, at least there's little doubt about his credibility as one of the great game makers of all time, right? Right? No longer. Now doubts have arisen about Yuji Naka's abilities as a game developer too, something that was previously unimaginable. From the mid-80s and straight through the 1990s, Naka's record as a programmer for Sega was impeccable. He ported the super-scaling arcade game Space Harrier to the 8-bit Master System, a feat that seemed utterly impossible when you consider the downgrade in hardware that he was working with. He programmed the original Phantasy Star, where once again, he squeezed every ounce of potential out of the Master System, generating the brilliant 3D scrolling dungeons the game is most famous for. But he also worked on the excellent Phantasy Star sequel for the Sega Genesis, and he is also credited with programming the Genesis port of Ghouls and Ghosts, which is renowned for its quality. But of course, Yuji Naka was most famous for being the head programmer on Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 2, as well as Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. The man was a legend, and like Shigeru Miyamoto, one of the few true big names of video games that everyone recognized. Maybe not by your mom. She was more interested in Tom Selleck, but maybe your math teacher and your weird cousin Carl actually knew who Yuji Naka was, and they probably thought he was pretty cool too. However, once the gaming industry shifted towards more advanced hardware in the mid and late 90s, with the Sega Saturn and the Dreamcast, Naka's legacy as a game maker was never quite as impeccable. Nights into Dreams in 1996 was Naka's first 3D game, and not incidentally, his very last as an actual programmer. It's widely regarded as an essential title for the Saturn, but there are those who believe that, well, this game just wasn't as much fun to play as it was provocatively original. As original as a 3D clone of the arcade classic Lupin from 1982 can actually be, that is. Come on, look at them side by side and tell me that Nights isn't just Lupin mixed with the rings from Sonic the Hedgehog. I've been told that this game is a lot of fun, and I've also been told that Citizen Kane is one of the best movies ever made. Rosebud. After this critical hit game, Yuji Naka was a full-fledged producer, and his first original game was Sonic R, developed by Traveler's Tale, which has the dubious honor of being the very first bad 3D Sonic game that was ever officially released. It's essentially a kart racer, but with 3D sprites that awkwardly stumble around as the camera struggles to keep up with every twist and turn. The critics were not kind to this wacky game back in the day, but the absurd soundtrack has become kind of a classic among cheese lovers everywhere. In 1998, Yuji Naka saw two more major releases as a producer, Burning Rangers for the Sega Saturn and Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast. Burning Rangers is a lot like Nights into Dreams, insofar as it was widely praised by game critics, but perhaps with a bit too much fervor. My view is that it's a fairly sloppy 3D platformer with drab graphics and a ton of pop-up and jittery polygons. Sonic Adventure, directed by Takashi Iizuka, was much better. This was a true event game, which properly showcased what the Sega Dreamcast was all about. Sonic Adventure was both a critical and commercial success for both Yuji Naka and Sega. Then in 1999, Yuji Naka would get into the director's role once more with Choo Choo Rocket for the Dreamcast, a fun but relatively simple puzzle game about guiding a herd of mice safely to a launch pad. Critics were all about this game, and it added credence to the idea that Yuji Naka was a genius-level game master. The year 2000 was also strong, with Yuji Naka producing both Samba de Amigo, a fun rhythm game for the Dreamcast, and Phantasy Star Online, a multiplayer action RPG that made use of the Dreamcast's online functionality. This is a cult classic and popular with a small niche of hardcore enthusiasts to this very day. 2001 saw the release of Sonic Adventure 2, which was fun but not as well regarded as Sonic Adventure 1, and there were a couple of Game Boy Advanced games in there too. And then the Dreamcast failed, Sega announced their exit from the console industry, and the next 20 years of Yuji Naka's career was pretty disappointing. In 2003, Billy Hatcher and the Giant Egg was a pretty good game for the Nintendo GameCube, but it was neither a critical or commercial success. Sonic Heroes was also released for all the big platforms in 2003, and it established a trend of general mediocrity and critical indifference that has plagued 3D Sonic games all the way to the present. With this game, I think, the Sonic series established itself as a niche exclusively for Sonic the Hedgehog mega fans, an interesting group of people to say the least. Then Shadow the Hedgehog would be released in 2005 to similar effect, and then Sonic Riders in 2006, which was mostly panned. Also released in 2006 was the infamous Sonic 06 for the PS3 and Xbox 360, a disaster of a game that was widely regarded as the worst Sonic game ever made.
Why are you helping me?
No special reason.
Yuji Naka started off as this game's producer, but he left Sega in the middle of development to start his own game studio called Probe. Why did Yuji Naka do this? Did he realize Sonic 06 was doomed to failure? In 2004, Sega was bought in a hostile takeover by Sammy. Did he not like working under the new Sega ownership? After all, lots of top Sega talent was either fired or quit during this same time period. Well, according to an article with Brandon Sheffield at GameDeveloper.com in December of 2008, Naka revealed that he simply disliked his position as a producer at Sega, and he wanted to step back into a more hands-on creative role, closer to the way he worked as a young programmer in the 80s and 90s. Thus, starting Probe was supposed to be Yuji Naka's big opportunity to, once again, display his full creative potential. However, things didn't really turn out that well. From what I can tell, Probe seems to have been set up to aim squarely at the lucrative casual gaming market that had only just emerged thanks to the success of smartphones and Nintendo's Wii, a console for babies and old people. Between 2009 and 2017, Probe produced around 26 games for play on iOS or Android-based devices. One of Naka's first games under the Probe label got some notoriety stemming from the sheer novelty of Naka becoming essentially an indie game developer. The game was Let's Tap, a rhythm game that was originally released for the Nintendo Wii, making unique use of the gimmicky Wii remotes. But other than the strange method of play, you literally tap your hands to trigger an action, the game was underwhelming. There was also Let's Catch, which is yet more Wii shovelware, as was Ivy the Kiwi, a Flappy Bird clone with a twist, and a game called Fishing Resort. which is a fishing game in case you didn't know. So yeah, Probe made a ton of iPhone games and Wii shovelware. But then there was Rodea the Sky Soldier, an original character-driven action game that was finished for the Wii in 2011. This was Probe's chance to make a big splash and prove Yuji Naka still had the magical touch. It was, for the time, a massively ambitious game, with unique zipline flying mechanics, big colorful levels, and a cast of cool anime characters on an epic fantasy adventure. Rodea the Sky Soldier had style and genuinely appealing personality, but more importantly, the gameplay was good. Indeed, possibly very good. It's no exaggeration to say that Rodea the Sky Soldier was Yuji Naka's best game since the Dreamcast, and it was, according to some fans of the game, one of the best games ever made for the Wii. But there was a problem. Despite being completed in 2011, the game's publisher, Kadokawa Corporation, refused to release the game, insisting on a simultaneous launch for both the Wii U and the Nintendo 3DS. Kadokawa Games took up the development of the Wii U port of Rodea the Sky Soldier themselves, and unfortunately for Probe, this took over 3 years, and Rodea the Sky Soldier wasn't released until November 2015, and exclusively for the Wii U and the 3DS, because by this time, the Wii was history, and thus Probe's version of the game was never officially released. And that's a bummer, because despite having slightly better graphics, Rodea the Sky Soldier for the Wii U was essentially a different game, and this new version, totally sucked. However, not all was lost. In order to give people a chance to experience the original version of the game, the initial release of Rodea the Sky Soldier on the Wii U came bundled with a free copy of Probe's version of the game, in the form of a bonus disc. Nintendo Force's review of Rodea summarizes this situation nicely. My advice? Buy Rodea the Sky Soldier for the Wii U. Toss the Wii U disc into a nearby sewage canal, and pop the Wii disc into your machine and let her spin. Woohoo! No, I couldn't have said it better myself. The Rodea the Sky Soldier episode is very unfortunate for both Yuji Naka and his company Probe. It was a very good game doomed to obscurity by odd decisions of the publisher, and unfortunately, this also led to Probe's implosion as a game development company. By 2017, Yuji Naka openly admitted that the only remaining employee at Probe was, well, Yuji Naka himself. I can't help but think that had Rodea been released in 2011 for the Wii, Yuji Naka would have been able to retain much more of his credibility as a big-time visionary game maker, and perhaps Probe would have been able to continue on in a positive direction. Instead, Yuji Naka was hired by Square Enix, the makers of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and in 2018, he was given his own division and a bunch of money in order to make a big-time game worthy of his status as an industry legend. Unfortunately, what Naka made was Balan Wonderland, released in 2021, a game allegedly so terrible it was regarded by many to be the worst game of the year, and that's the same year that Cyberpunk 2077 was released. Just wow! Hey guys, enjoying the video? We certainly hope so, but I just need to interrupt for a second here to tell you about Raid Shadow Legends. No, just kidding. Actually, you may have noticed a few seconds ago that I called Balan Wonderworld Balan Wonderland. Oops! Here's the thing, guys. I'm actually from an alternative universe. A parallel world, if you will. But my world is exactly the same as yours in every way, except Balan Wonderworld is called Balan Wonderland. Twinkies are filled with chocolate, Spider-Man is a Chinese guy, and the video game developer that made the new Sonic Superstars is called Azrest instead of Arzest. Yeah, in my world, we never called Arzest Arzest. We say Azrest. And we say Balan Wonderland instead of Balan Wonderworld. Also, we only have 4 fingers on each hand. Interesting, right? Well, I apologize about the discrepancy in this video. Hopefully I can get back to my own world soon. I enjoy being able to speak the same language as your version of Spider-Man, Spanish, but your white Twinkies are just disgusting. And also, none of your gloves fit me very well. So thanks for understanding the discrepancy. and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Bye-bye now. I'm not gonna belabor how incredibly awkward and misguided Balan Wonderland is, because at this point the internet is overloaded with detailed reviews and funny memes about this odd and probably misunderstood game. I'm sure that you all have seen and heard plenty about it already, like this really strange musical number with a corn farmer from level 1. It's unique, sweet, and yet somehow bland to the point of tastelessness. Sort of like corn itself. That's what this game is. It's high fructose corn syrup, a staple of our childhood diets that we as adults now aggressively try and avoid as much as possible, lest we go blind and have our feet amputated from type 2 diabetes. So I'm sure you've already had your fill of Balan Wonderland, and yet I'm just as sure that the vast majority of you guys have never actually played the game. That's because Balan Wonderland, despite being in development for 3 years and utilizing the AAA resources of Square Enix, managed to sell less than 2,100 physical copies its first week on the store shelves in Japan. Indeed, the game failed to sell anywhere and was quickly dumped in the bargain bins. Prior to the game's release though, the prospects for Balan Wonderland seemed great. The internet was buzzing with trailers, articles, and tons of promotional material. In July of 2020, Square Enix published a YouTube video showcasing behind-the-scenes insights into how Balan Wonderland was being made. It featured dramatic music, tons of conceptual art, some nervous-looking artists and engineers, but most importantly, this video showed that Yuji Naka had gotten back together with his longtime collaborator and friend from Sega, Naoto Oshima, who can be seen here gruffly posing with an exuberant Yuji Naka, who even wore a white top hat for the occasion. How zany is that? How can you not love this guy? So who is this Naoto Oshima guy? Like Yuji Naka, Naoto Oshima was part of a special cohort of young talent that was recruited by Sega in the mid-80s. Only Oshima was not hired for his technical acumen, but rather his skill as a graphical artist. Naka and Oshima would first come together working on the original Phantasy Star games, but their big break as a team came in 1990 when Oshima drew a brand new original game character for Sega that was meant to rival Nintendo's Mario. No, not him. No one likes him anymore. No, of course we're talking about Sonic the Hedgehog. Combined with Yuji Naka's programming and innovative fast-scrolling game mechanics that literally put a new spin on the side-scrolling action platformer, Sonic the Hedgehog would go on to sell 15 million copies worldwide, and as Sega's official pack-in game for the rebranded Genesis, it would help propel Sega into the #1 sales spot, briefly dethroning Nintendo in the first half of the 1990s. Thus, it should come as no surprise to hear that the team of Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima would be brought together again and again over the years. First, more or less incidentally, but then officially as the spiritual heart and soul of Sonic Team, which after AM2 was easily Sega's most prestigious game division going all the way into the 2000s. Yet surprisingly, this dream team wasn't assembled right away, and for a few years between 1991 and 1994, Yuji Naka would leave Sega of Japan to work with the Sega Technical Institute at Sega of America in the San Francisco Bay Area. There, Yuji Naka would work as the head programmer on Sonic 2, Sonic 3, and Sonic & Knuckles, but never officially as a project director. Naoto Oshima, during the same time period, actually was promoted to be a full-fledged game director, and his first game was Sonic CD for the Sega CD, a game some people still regard as the very best of that first generation of Sonic games. I'm not sure if that's true, but Sonic CD is definitely my favorite Sonic game from the time period. Yet, despite the fact that it was Naoto Oshima who created Sonic the Hedgehog as a character, and despite Yuji Naka not being the director of any of the original Sonic games, it is an astonishing twist of fate that Yuji Naka would become renowned in America as the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, giving credence to the popular belief that Yuji Naka has managed to somehow self-promote himself over the rest of the original Sonic team, especially Naoto Oshima, who literally is the creator of Sonic as a recognizable piece of popular culture. But I think this is a mistake. I think Naka's fame as the so-called creator of Sonic the Hedgehog is an unintended consequence of the fact that Yuji Naka, for a few years during the development of Sonic 2 and Sonic 3, lived and worked in the United States, where he was more accessible for interviews with the American press. And it's the American press and Western Sega fans who generated the myth that Yuji Naka single-handedly created Sonic the Hedgehog, not Naka himself. For instance, there was an interview with Sega Visions magazine in the August issue of 1992 in which Sega Visions asked, "What were some of the things you thought about when you first created the Sonic character?" A question that clearly presupposes that credit for Sonic belongs to Yuji Naka. Naka, who admits to not being able to speak much English, responded as follows, by way of a translation. "At first we used a character that looked like a rabbit, with ears that could extend and pick up objects. As the game got faster and faster, we needed to come up with special characteristics to give our character some power over his enemies. I remembered a character I'd thought about years ago who could roll himself into a ball and slam into enemies. Hedgehogs can roll themselves into a ball, so we decided to go from a rabbit to a hedgehog." So Yuji Naka, as quoted by Sega Visions, doesn't exactly clarify that he didn't single-handedly create Sonic the Hedgehog, but he does repeatedly use the plural pronoun we in order to describe the thought process that went into picking a hedgehog as the game's protagonist. But like I said, by his own admission, Naka does not speak English, and therefore whatever Sega Visions has put down here as his words cannot literally be his words, because they would have been first translated from Japanese and likely edited for brevity. A lot can be lost or mutated in translation, and this may have included a reference to Naoto Oshima as the artist who actually gave form to the Sonic the Hedgehog concept. There's obviously a much more complex story here, but Sega Visions opted to tell the simple story, and essentially a simple story about a single causal agent making things happen is both easier to tell and to remember, and so it's the simple story that sticks around. This is the reason why so many people believe Steve Jobs created the iPhone, like all by himself. It's a simple story that's easy to pitch and easy to catch at the same time. To his credit, I found an instance when Yuji Naka clearly indicates that the creation of the original Sonic the Hedgehog was a group effort and not his own private creation. In the January 1997 issue of Sega magazine, in an interview with both Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima about the formation of Sonic Team, Naka says the following about the origins of Sonic. "One unique thing about Sonic, though, was that we started the project with 5 people, eventually expanding to 7, and it really was a combined effort of those people. That was my first time planning a game like that, as a team. Before that, typically a single person drafted the plans for a game. Sonic was made in joint consultation with Oshima all the way, and we got into a really good groove." Wow. These aren't the words of a man hogging credit. These are the words of a man who understands the value of collaboration and the necessity of relying upon the best strengths of others in order to realize a lofty goal. Clearly, Yuji Naka both respects and values Naoto Oshima's contributions as a graphic designer. At least that was the case back in 1997, just months after the launch of Nights into Dreams for the Sega Saturn, which was the first collaboration between Naka and Oshima since they had worked together on the original Sonic the Hedgehog game back in 1990. But what's the situation today, in the future world of the 2020s, where UFOs and space aliens are real, and yet no one gives a shit? Boy howdy, have things really changed. On July 5th, 2022, Yuji Naka celebrated the 26th anniversary of Nights into Dreams on Twitter, sharing a photo of himself and the rest of Sonic Team that was taken at a Japanese trade show back in the 90s. The oddest thing about this photo, however, wasn't the appearance of Hudson Soft's Bomberman. Talk about photobombing, right? No, the really strange thing was the fact that Naka had blocked out one of the people featured in the original photo. Who's missing? It's Naoto Oshima. What happened between Naka and Oshima that would warrant this level of Japanese high school contempt? Yuji Naka explains on Twitter, "How would you feel if you were suddenly removed from a game that you had worked hard on for 2 years, and when you went to court, you found out that they'd been talking about me behind my back in court documents, and that is why I was removed from the game?" What in the name of Google Translate is Yuji Naka talking about? It turns out this is a reference to Balan Wonderland. Balan Wonderland, as we've said, was supposed to be a big deal, and mainly that's because the game was marketed as the momentous reunification of Naoto Oshima and Yuji Naka, the co-creators of Sonic the Hedgehog and Nights into Dreams, a game that many people still regard as being the functional equivalent of a true mascot game for the Sega Saturn, since, you know, the Saturn never really got a proper 3D Sonic game. Together, Naka and Oshima also produced Burning Rangers, and their final game, as a team, was Sonic Adventure, the first true 3D Sonic game, and one of the most beloved games of Sega's final video game console, the Dreamcast. Thus, in the eyes of hardcore Sega fans in the know, the combination of Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima could only mean one thing: absolute magic. And so after more than 20 years, people were eagerly looking forward to the next game from the co-creators of Sega's greatest franchise. But instead we got Balan Wonderland, universally mocked, reviled, and thanks to a poorly received free demo that was released by Square Enix, the game's publisher, just weeks before its official launch in March of 2021, Balan Wonderland was also a major commercial flop. It seems that after playing the first level for free, relatively few people were interested in paying full price for more. Not long after its release, Balan Wonderland was on sale for 70% off. To this day, the game is still available at an extremely low price, pretty much anywhere you can find it, because sadly, no one wants it. Plainly, the development of Balan Wonderland did not go well, and you can tell, despite Naka's playful enthusiasm here in the promo video, that Naoto Oshima is none too pleased with the situation he's in. I mean, the dude looks totally pissed here. So what happened? Indeed, the production of Balan Wonderland really was a mess, and it all comes down to that classic tale that's as old as time: too many heads, too many decision makers, and no unified vision. While the game was published by Square Enix, it was actually developed not by one but two separate studios simultaneously. Yuji Naka started his own so-called Balan company as a subsidiary of Square Enix, and it's clear that he had big plans for the future, envisioning an entire franchise with multiple games, spin-offs, lots of merchandising, and perhaps even a movie. Big dreams of Pokemon proportions. Working in conjunction with Balan Company was Azrest, a video game developer founded in 2010 by Naoto Oshima, who had left Sega back in the days of the Dreamcast. Azrest up until this point was mainly known for its contributions to the Nintendo 3DS, their most famous game probably being Yoshi's New Island, a game that, to be honest, wasn't really very well liked. So Balan Wonderland was the product of Balan Company and Azrest working together, but it's not all that clear how this sort of arrangement was supposed to work. How can you coordinate two separate teams in two separate locations? Well, to be fair, it appears that Balan Company never really consisted of anyone more than just Yuji Naka himself, the game's official director, and maybe a few concept artists. Naoto Oshima seems to have been officially a partner in the venture, but this may have been little more than marketing, capitalizing on the nostalgic union of Naka and Oshima. In reality, Oshima's days as an actual game designer are long behind him, and though he's credited as the character designer for Balan Wonderland, a dubious honor to be sure, I seriously doubt Oshima actually lifted his pen to create any of the bland, generic, and wholly uninspired characters or creatures found within Balan Wonderland. Oshima may not have been the greatest game director of all time, but his art was always fun and lively. Balan Wonderland, by comparison, looks like mid-90s Microsoft clip art come to life. No, today Naoto Oshima is a businessman running an entire company, Azrest, and it's Azrest that did the bulk of the technical work on Balan Wonderland, while Yuji Naka attempted to creatively steer the project from a distance, like maybe from another planet? But of course this was going to be a problem, because Naka's vision was not only wildly ambitious, proposing something like 80 unique special abilities that could be acquired throughout gameplay, but he allegedly also had a proclivity for changing his mind and proposing costly revisions after work had already been completed. And for his part, Yuji Naka was publicly very unhappy with Azrest. He believed that the studio's work was shoddy and buggy. Ultimately, the game took nearly 3 years to complete, and Square Enix was not happy with how things turned out. With Yuji Naka, Balan Wonderland took too long to make and cost too much money, and anybody with eyeballs would have known that fundamentally reality, the game was turning out to be a disappointment. But Naka blamed Azrest for the game's shortcomings, and allegedly demanded that they fix the game, free of charge. At the same time, both Square Enix and Azrest must have had major problems with Yuji Naka as well, because 6 months prior to the game's release, sometime around September or October of 2020, Square Enix fired Yuji Naka as the director of Balan Wonderland, just weeks after he appeared in this behind-the-scenes promotional video with Naoto Oshima, the one where he's goofing around in a white top hat. Look at him, who would want to fire this kind of disarming enthusiasm? It's not really clear why this happened, other than the disastrous production of Balan Wonderland at large, Naka's vision being unrestrained, development slow, and the final product inadequate. But was this really all Yuji Naka's fault? He had no direct control over how Azrest executed his vision, an enormous logistical oversight, and complicating everything in the middle of production. Japan was hit by the virus. You know the one. And during the same time period, Naka reports that he became very ill, and that he was unable to work as much as he wanted. It's possible that Naka suffered complications from COVID, or complications from treatment, and may have bartered for more time to fix the game once he was better, but they said no. And so Yuji Naka went ahead and sued Square Enix for firing him and releasing his game in an unfinished state. Oddly enough, Naka's complaint wasn't regarding the oversimplistic gameplay or wacky graphics or bizarre tone, but rather he was upset about the music. Naka alleged that Square Enix and Azrest failed to make use of important original compositions meant for the game. But even more specifically, Naka thought that the free demo released in January of 2020 misrepresented his intended final vision because it didn't have the right music. It's not clear to me what Naka actually accomplished from this lawsuit, nor is it all that clear who won or whether or not they settled out of court, which they most likely did. But Square Enix did in fact confirm to Bloomberg that both the lawsuit was real and that Balan Wonderland was a game that Square Enix actually recommended with confidence. Oh, so then Naka's bosses at Square Enix did like the game then. They wouldn't lie, would they? Anyway, it was from suing Square Enix that Yuji Naka discovered that Naoto Oshima had been part of a group of individuals who had complained about Naka to Balan Wonderland's head producer at Square Enix, a guy named Noriyoshi Fujimoto. As Naka himself admitted on Twitter, there was a whole group of people unhappy with his conduct as the game's director. The producer was mad because he needed the game to be completed according to strict deadlines. The head of marketing was mad, probably because it was his job to publish a working demo to promote the game, and Naka was refusing to go along because the special music wasn't ready. Yet the head of the sound team was also mad at Naka for refusing to release a demo with generic music, and thus the managing director at Square had to get involved as well. But most alarming to me is that according to Naka, even human resources had to be called into the situation. In my experience, human resources only gets involved in these sorts of conflicts when someone crosses a line of personal conduct. So now I have this image of Yuji Naka going ballistic and throwing Balan Wonderland conceptual art all over the place. Outrage! Outrage! But Naoto Oshima, the president of the company developing Balan Wonderland under Naka's creative guidance and one half of Balan Company, was also super mad at Yuji Naka because Naka had blamed the game's shortcomings on Oshima's game studio, Azrest, and he insisted that Azrest fix the game for free. Did Azrest mess up Balan Wonderland? Did they fail to realize Naka's grand vision? It's hard to say. Naka didn't actually work with these people in person on a day-to-day basis, and since he wasn't actually their boss or part of Azrest himself, they really had no meaningful accountability to him. Whoever was really at fault ultimately didn't matter because the game came out too late, cost too much money, and underperformed big time. In the end, someone had to pay, and I think Yuji Naka was a fairly convenient scapegoat. Despite his charm and disarming good looks, the fact is, people tend not to like Yuji Naka, and so, well, fuck 'em. Fire Naka and just blame the shitty game on the fact that he wanted special music. But in the eyes of Yuji Naka, his old friend and Sonic co-creator, Naoto Oshima, had betrayed him with profound impact. Not only had Azrest delivered a game short of what he hoped, but Oshima had gone behind Naka's back to ally himself with a contingency that sought his termination from Square Enix, effectively ending Naka's career as a game developer in disgrace. Given that, it's kind of understandable why Naka would marijuana Black Oshima out of a photo depicting the glory of his past. I'm not saying I agree with this action, but I'm just saying I understand it. After Balan Wonderland came out, Yuji Naka was not only down, but he was mostly out as well.
Oh my god!
Popular opinion about the Sega legend began to sour as Naka was dogpiled with negative anecdotes and public doubts about whether or not he really ever was the great game maker we all supposed he was in the 90s and early 2000s. Now out of a job, Naka suddenly became highly active on Twitter, often ruminating about his glory days at Sega, or exploring hobbies like car racing, flying drones, or just hanging out with his kids. Then on July 7th, 2022, Naka became gaming news once again when an old Sega story, which first circulated in the early 2000s, re-emerged on Twitter. The tweet referenced an old interview with Chris Sean, a former game designer at the Sega Technical Institute in the mid-1990s, who had previously worked on the infamous Sonic Extreme, a never-released 3D Sonic game that was intended to be both the first 3D Sonic game ever made, as well as the flagship mascot game for the 32-bit Saturn. Had the game actually come out the Christmas of 1996 as intended. Chris Sean is quoted in the tweet referencing the story about how at their desperate hour of need, the Sonic Extreme development team at STI reached out to Bernie Stoller and Sega of Japan for help finishing their languishing game. In order to finish Sonic Extreme, STI needed a working 3D game engine and level editor for the Sega Saturn. Sonic team had been working on Nights into Dreams around the same time period. Nights was in reality a 2D action game on rails that made use of 3D polygons for an updated effect. Gameplay itself mostly consisted of attempting to steer a Sonic-like clown as it flies loop-de-loops through a bunch of rings. As I've said before, the loop-in mechanic was as old as video arcades themselves, but the goal of moving 3D objects through rings was an unfortunate byproduct of the limited 3D architecture of the late 90s. To me, Nights was every bit as disappointing as games like Superman 64 or Pilot Wings, but at the time the Sonic team branding and the novelty were sufficient to elevate Nights to a must-play status. Even today's Saturn fans like to look back on Nights as an essential Sega title, a myth probably conserved due to the sheer lack of people alive today who've actually even played it. I mean, who was actually willing to buy the special controller that you had to get in order to play it correctly? Not a ton of people who weren't already deeply and emotionally invested in everything Sega, like a cult. Anyway, the point is, like it or not, Nights was a working 3D action game made for the Saturn, internally by Sega employees, and by Sonic Team no less. Therefore, the Nights game engine seemed to be the perfect solution for the desperate time-crunched team at STI. All they had to do was take somebody else's game design, manipulate the graphics and levels to look like a Sonic game, and bam! Sonic Extreme could be in stores by Christmas of 1996. A Generation X solution, copying someone else's work for a Generation X problem, procrastination. And so, legend has it, Sega of Japan sent game code and a level editor to Sega of America, and Sonic Extreme was finally on the fast track to actually being finished. Until they were almost immediately told to stop everything, abandon the code, and start all over again, effectively dooming the project. Why? According to Mike Wallace, a former producer at Sega of America, when Yuji Naka found out that STI was using his game code from Nights into Dreams in order to make a 3D Sonic game for the Saturn, he got angry and issued Sega an ultimatum. Either STI stop using his game code from Nights, or else he quits. So rather than lose Yuji Naka, Sega opted to take away STI's only real chance of being able to finish Sonic Extreme by Christmas 1996. So essentially, it was all Yuji Naka's fault for being a selfish prima donna. Or was it? Being highly active on Twitter in 2022, Yuji Naka saw the tweets going around about how he had jealously guarded the Nights game engine, therefore dooming the release of Sonic Extreme, and he was none too pleased, referring to the famous story as a complete lie. According to Naka, this event never happened. No one from Sega of America ever asked for code or a game engine from Nights. Further, Naka says that the code for Knights was written entirely in assembly, and that it was so specialized, lacking even much in the way of documentation, that no other programmer would have been able to use it, especially not the Sonic Extreme team back at STI, since Sonic Extreme was being coded in C++, a different, higher-level computer language. Then someone asked Naka what did actually happen to Sonic Extreme, if he wasn't the guy who killed it. Naka says, "They made a Sonic game without my knowledge, and without my permission, and when they couldn't make it themselves, the project was terminated. I guess I feel like they're lying to make it my fault, as I have never seen it, and had nothing to do with it. It's a terrible story." The plot thickens. But what are we to make of Naka's claim here? A couple of programmers chimed in on the Twitter thread and dismissed Naka's assertion that it would have been impossible to translate Sonic Team's assembly code from Knights into C++, even without documentation. Perhaps this would have been impractical, challenging, but not literally impossible. However, that's not to say that coding a complex 3D game on the Saturn in C++ would have made much sense. Indeed, during the 16-bit and 8-bit era, most all video games, be they Sega or Nintendo, were typically coded in hardware-specific assembly language, in order to maximize gameplay performance and cut back on the use of internal memory. This would have also pertained to the Saturn. Because assembly is a so-called low-level programming language, it's more inconvenient to work with for the programmer, but it allows for direct, simple communication with the console's hardware. C, on the other hand, is a so-called high-level language that makes for a more convenient coding environment for a programmer, but does so at the expense of both speed and memory. So let's imagine that STI really did get Naka's code for Knights into Dreams. It's true that they might have eventually been able to convert it into C++, but it's also true that doing so would have almost certainly ensured that the resulting Sonic game would run like shit. Indeed, all existing incomplete versions of Sonic Extreme, and STI went through a few of them, already ran like shit. Compiling assembly language into C and then building a game in C on top of that wouldn't necessarily have been all that helpful. Indeed, from what is actually known about Sonic Extreme, it really was written entirely in C, which was probably a fundamental error. I mean, just look at this disaster. But Naka also claims that the Knights program was so special that it's impossible to use for anything else, strongly implying that the code was just unusable for a single game by necessity. Oh, really? Then how does Yuji Naka explain Burning Rangers for the Sega Saturn in 1998? In an interview with Sega Saturn magazine from July of 1998, Yuji Naka states that Burning Rangers had been built upon the Knights into Dreams game engine, despite the fact that Burning Rangers is an extremely different game. Either Naka is misquoted and Burning Rangers really isn't based on Knights into Dreams, or Yuji Naka is wrong to say that STI could have never built a 3D game out of the code made for Knights, because Sonic Team did that exact same thing, and here it is. Personally, I'm open to either possibility. There are a couple of other odd things about Naka's version of events on Twitter. Naka complains that STI both made a Sonic game without his knowledge and without his permission. And I think by revealing that this would frustrate or anger him, that Naka may have accidentally implied that the story is at least partially true. And maybe Naka did in some way oppose the creation of Sonic Extreme by way of his Knights code. Because if the story was made up just to use Naka as a scapegoat, wouldn't his outrage be limited to that parameter? Why would Naka care if they made a Sonic game without his knowledge or permission? Surely, Yuji Naka is aware of the fact that he is not the sole creator or owner of Sonic the Hedgehog. And surely it ought to be Naoto Oshima who's miffed at the complete lack of creative control over something he designed, not Naka. So then why would STI need Yuji Naka's permission? Second, I find it really hard to believe that Yuji Naka had no idea that STI was trying to make a 3D Sonic game. He had to have known. How? Let's go back to the 90s to find out. The 1990s in America. Bill Clinton was the president. Everyone wore flannel. Marvel comics were more popular than ever. Baseball cards were money. Mulder, Scully, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was actually less popular than this guy.
Got any cheese?
and Sonic the Hedgehog had become the official mascot of Sega. Sonic's super cool persona and blazing fast video games drove the success of the company. Sonic meant console sales, merchandising, and gave Sega an opportunity to stand toe-to-toe with Nintendo. Sonic was so much a part of Sega's apparent success story in the 90s that it's perfectly reasonable to infer that Sega needed Sonic the Hedgehog going forward. It would have been unthinkable, for instance, to imagine Sega releasing a brand new video game console without Sonic the Hedgehog, and yet the unthinkable did happen, twice. The short-lived 32X add-on for the Sega Genesis, released in November of 1994, never got a proper Sonic game, and neither did the Sega Saturn, released in the US in May of 1995. Despite being around until 1998, it also never got a proper entry in the main Sonic series. Sure, there were spin-offs and repackaged Sega Genesis games, but nothing Sonic fans really wanted or expected. This is crazy because even the Master System and Sega Game Gear had proper Sonic games. The Dreamcast, released in 1999, was careful to make sure it launched with a true Sonic game. So what in the heck happened to the 32X and the Saturn? Bad planning and diminishing returns. By 1993, the long-term plans for both the Mars 32X and the Sega Saturn had been established, along with plans for a cheaper cartridge-only version of the Sega Saturn called the Sega Jupiter. Sega's next generation of consoles would all be based entirely upon an agreement with Hitachi, wherein Sega agreed to use Hitachi's new SH2 microprocessor for all of their new 32-bit game consoles. However, by the summer of 1993, Sega panicked, realizing that the future of console gaming was going to be 3D. Thus, late in 1993, Sega changed the proposed hardware specs for both the 32X and the Saturn by adding a second Hitachi SH2 processor. This new configuration allowed the Saturn and the 32X to simulate the 3D polygonal architecture of the PlayStation and N64, but at a heavy price. The Saturn and 32X had to be programmed in assembly, and the additional hardware and programming required to make 3D graphics with twin processors meant that both consoles were hard to make games for. This slowed potential third-party support for either platform, and even if Sega themselves had dedicated teams of game designers, they were now split, working on several consoles simultaneously. Keeping in mind that in 1993, Sega was still heavily tied up with the Sega Genesis, which would continue to be relevant for the next couple of years. The confluence of all these things, the last-minute revision of new hardware that was difficult to program for, the introduction of two new consoles that were incompatible with each other, and the need to keep making games for the Genesis all meant that there was going to be a shortage of games all around. Sega and its third parties were guaranteed to be spread too thin. So in the face of this incredibly challenging scenario, who is going to make the next Sonic the Hedgehog? From what little we know, it seems clear that this was Sega's intention, a new Sonic game for not only the Genesis as usual, but also the 32X and the Sega Saturn. The Sega Jupiter was cancelled fairly early on. And of course, it was gonna be our boy, our hero, Yuji Naka, and Hirokazu Yasuhara, and Takashi Yuda, and like literally 100 other people, who throughout 1993 and 1994 were all working hard on Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles for the Sega Genesis. Sonic & Knuckles was developed at STI in California by an all-Japanese development team, and was officially released in October of 1994 to wide acclaim. Indeed, Sonic 2 had also been developed at STI by a Japanese team, in much the same way, and that included Yuji Naka himself, who had come to STI in 1991 after being persuaded to move to California by STI's founder, Mark Cerny. Yes, that Mark Cerny. After Yuji Naka had quit Sega of Japan because of a dispute with management regarding his pay. Thus, from 1991 to 1994, Yuji Naka worked at STI as part of Sega of America, and for the sole purpose of being the lead programmer for Sonic 2, Sonic 3, and of course, Sonic & Knuckles. When Sonic & Knuckles launched in the fall of 1994, Naka was most likely still at STI in California, ensuring the game was completed in time for Christmas. This would have been just before the 32X launched in North America, and the Sega Saturn launched in Japan, both of which occurred in November of 1994. Looking at a timeline, we can see that Yuji Naka and what we might call Sonic Team had been working on Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles throughout the entirety of 1993 and up to October of 1994, a much longer development cycle than was required for either Sonic the Hedgehog or Sonic 2. But then who is working on the next Sonic game for the 32X and the Sega Saturn? Saturn? Well, what about Naoto Oshima? After the success of Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991 and Yuji Naka left Sega of Japan to work at STI in California, Naoto Oshima stayed in Japan to lead the development of the acclaimed Sonic CD, or the Sega CD attachment, arguably the greatest 2D Sonic game of the time period. Wouldn't Naoto Oshima have been absolutely perfect to lead the production of a sequel to Sonic CD for either the 32X or the Sega Saturn? Let's look at the timeline. Sonic CD was released in Japan in September of 1993, around the same time that the 32X and Sega Saturn hardware specs had been more or less determined. If Oshima started a new project that winter, in 1993, then it's conceivable that he could have led the completion of a sequel to Sonic CD in time for the release date of either the 32X in North America or the Saturn in Japan, again both of which occurred in November of 1994. Indeed, I think it's likely that this was Sega's original plan. If you examine Naoto Oshima's career at Sega, there is a mysteriously wide gap between his completed game projects. Between the release of Sonic CD in September 1993 and the release of Oshima's next game, Nights into Dreams for the Sega Saturn in July of 1996. It appears as if Naoto Oshima produced nothing new at Sega. This is over a year and a half without a game credit. Obviously, this is just a hypothesis and I can't really prove it right now, but it's hard to imagine Naoto Oshima was doing anything other than Sonic the Hedgehog during this same time period. Just as hard as it is to believe that Yuji Naka didn't know that STI had begun work on a 3D Sonic game in 1994, seeing as Yuji Naka actually worked at STI that very same year. Indeed, one of Naka's goals while working at STI was, in fact, to make the first 3D Sonic game. In an interview with Sega Magazine from February of 1995, which was translated by Gryson at the Mega Drive Shock, Yuji Naka and his Sonic 3 teammate Takashi Iizuka and Takashi Yuta talk about their original intentions to make Sonic 3 the very first 3D Sonic game as early as 1993. In 1993, Sega revealed the Sega Virtual Processor, also known as the SVP chip. The SVP was a cheater chip. That is, a microprocessor meant to be inserted into game cartridges that could greatly enhance the performance of the Sega Genesis. If you've ever seen Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the one and only Sega game that ever utilized the SVP chip was the 1994 home port of Virtual Racing, which is ridiculous looking by today's standards, but absolutely blew people away at the time by rendering 3D polygons on the freaking Sega Genesis. What also blew people away, however, was the price tag. The SVP chip pushed the retail price for Virtual Racing on the Sega Genesis all the way up to $100, which was about twice the cost of your typical game in that same time period. But at least one other game was originally supposed to utilize the SVP chip that I know of. Sonic 3 for the Sega Genesis in 1994 was originally supposed to use the SVP chip, and the game itself was going to be the first true 3D Sonic game. According to Takashi Yuta, the rendered 3D characters from the title screen of both Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles represent something like what they originally intended the game to look like. Naka planned on giving the game a 3D isometric perspective, similar to the Sonic the Hedgehog arcade game from 1993, an extremely interesting game that was exclusive to Japan and which was played with a trackball controller, similar to Marble Madness or Centipede. Unfortunately, due to the very high cost of the SVP chip, Yuji Naka's dreams of making a 3D Sonic game died early. But surely, Naka's plan to successfully pioneer a 3D Sonic game was not forgotten. Indeed, there is yet another famous rumor that sometime in 1994, Yuji Naka visited STI and witnessed a presentation for a 3D Sonic game that would be produced for the 32X. Indeed, it is this 3D Sonic game that would eventually become Sonic Extreme for the Sega Saturn in 1995 and 1996. Allegedly, Naka was so unimpressed with what he witnessed at this presentation that all he could muster in response was a sardonic, "Good luck!" Or perhaps he said this in Japanese, "Good luck!" because Yuji Naka does not speak English. Here he is explaining to people on Twitter that he is dependent upon Google Translate, like so many of us. Actually, sometimes this exact anecdote goes that it was Takashi Iizuka who was present for the revelation of Sonic Extreme, and perhaps he was just confused for Naka, or is it the other way around? I guess the Japanese staff at STI in 1994 all looked the same to everyone else at Sega of America? The point is that allegedly some key figure from the Japanese staff at STI in 1994 was unimpressed with Sonic Extreme, and thus it is highly probable that Yuji Naka would have actually known about and perhaps even followed the development of Sonic Extreme as a project. He worked on a 3D Sonic game himself, he wanted to do a 3D Sonic game, and he was working at STI in California when Sonic Extreme was already being made. Did Yuji Naka know about Sonic Extreme? Of course Yuji Naka knew about the game. In light of this, I can't help but suspect that Yuji Naka is not being totally honest when he says that he didn't know about the development of Sonic Extreme and that he had nothing to do with the Knights engine being taken away from STI, leading to the cancellation of the game. He must have known about it because he was there, but what would have been his motive? People typically infer that he must have just hated STI, or just wanted to be a jerk, but I suspect there might be another reason Yuji Naka didn't want people seeing his code for Nights into Dreams. That is, in his code, perhaps there may have been clues that Nights into Dreams had also started off its existence as a failed 3D Sonic game for the Sega Saturn. But first we have to talk about 1994. Sega's long-term plans for Sonic the Hedgehog, and how bad planning threw everything into total chaos. As of 1993, it's clear that Sega had the following lineup, aiming for more or less simultaneous Sonic releases across 3 major platforms. Yuji Naka, Iizuka, and Yuma would tackle Sonic 3 for the Sega Genesis, and of course Sonic & Knuckles. Naoto Oshima and the crew fresh off of Sonic CD would tackle a Sonic game for the CD-based Sega Saturn. Let's call it Sonic Crackers. And finally, it's clear that the American wing of STI was given the task of developing a Sonic game for the American 32X. Sonic Mars, in fact, was the original working title, but then Sega canceled Sonic Crackers sometime in 1994, moved the game over to the 32X, and recycled assets in order to release Knuckles Chaotix in April of 1995. Also in 1994, probably at more or less the same time, Sega moved STI in America off of the 32X and over to the Sega Saturn. What happened? Well, as Tom Kalinske said, it's possible that the development of Sonic Crackers simply went poorly. However, I think it's also likely that Sega of Japan thought a 2D Sonic game wouldn't make much of an impact now that the Sega Saturn was being reconceived as a 3D game console, on par with Sony's PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. They may have realized, too late, that the Sega Saturn needed to have a properly 3D next-generation Sonic game for their next-generation hardware. STI had already started a 3D Sonic game for the 32X, so it must have seemed reasonable to believe STI had a good head start toward completing a 3D project for the Saturn relatively quickly.
You serious?
Meanwhile, around the same time, Sonic 3 was released on Groundhog Day, February 2nd, 1994, and though it was a drastically large endeavor for the time period, involving over 100 people, and it was critically acclaimed, it proceeded to be the worst-selling Sonic game ever made up to that point, eventually selling around 3 million copies worldwide, which sounds great until you compare it to Sonic 2 from 1992, which was made by a team of about 50 people in half the time, and sold more than 5 million copies in just North America alone. Sonic 1 is an even more stark contrast, since it was made by a team of about 13 people in less than a year and went on to sell more than 15 million copies in North America. Thus, you can see clearly what Sega probably saw in 1994. Sonic the Hedgehog was costing more and more to produce, with longer development cycles and drastically diminishing returns. Then in November of 1994, the 32X was released in North America, and it was a spectacular failure. The console had very few games at launch, and even its very best games were only average in terms of quality. And it's literally true that by spring of 1995, the 32X had a much more impressive library of canceled games than it did actual games on the store shelves. The 32X situation was a veritable dumpster fire, and Sega took extreme evasive action by swiftly abandoning the console. This more or less explains why Knuckles Chaotix was such a rushed afterthought of a game. Sega desperately needed to pad out the 32X library as soon as possible, and at the same time they were probably hoping a 3D Sonic game for the Saturn would have more impact than recent 2D Sonic games. Looking at the sales figures of Sonic 3 probably spooked Sega executives in 1994, and I reckon they thought 2D Sonic had little to no future in the company. Indeed, this may be the very reason Knuckles Chaotix was released without the inclusion of Sonic the Hedgehog as a character. That and the fact that the game is really not very good, and was obviously rushed to the market. So by the fall of 1994, Sega's 3-console plan for Sonic the Hedgehog now looked like this. The 32X would never get a real Sonic game, and indeed, it had no future. So it's done. The Saturn would launch in Japan without a Sonic game, but perhaps this wasn't such a big deal since Sonic games did little to drive sales in Japan anyway. Instead, STI would work on Sonic Extreme, probably with the Saturn's September 1995 American release date in mind. And in the meantime, Sonic was officially finished on the Sega Genesis with the release of Sonic & Knuckles in October of 1994. Sonic & Knuckles was actually the second half of Sonic 3's intended game content, but the Sonic 3 project grew so large and was so ambitious that the ROM cart could not facilitate sufficient memory without also driving up the price of the game drastically. The solution was the so-called lock-on cartridge, which allowed players to combine 2 separate games, Sonic 3 and then Sonic & Knuckles, into a single massive game, fully loaded with all the intended levels, playable characters, and so forth. Thus, the only way to really get the full experience was to buy 2 games at full price, and possibly, as a direct consequence, the sales for Sonic & Knuckles, the second half of the Sonic 3 couplet, only reached 1.24 million copies in North America, less than half of Sonic 3's sales figures, which were already the most disappointing ever recorded for a mainline Sonic entry ever. After the release of Sonic & Knuckles in the fall of 1994, Yuji Naka left STI in California and returned to Sega of Japan, where he immediately began learning to program for the newly launched Sega Saturn. Now, in multiple interviews from the time period, Yuji Naka has said that after Sonic 3, he wanted to move away from doing Sonic the Hedgehog. However, given the drastically diminishing returns from the Sonic franchise, I think it's actually more likely that Sega simply didn't want Naka working on any more Sonic games for the Sega Saturn. And anyway, as we've already shown, by the end of 1994, Sega of America had already begun working on Sonic Extreme, which was now Sega's official Plan B for showcasing Sonic on the Saturn. Naoto Oshima, on the other hand, re-emerges at Sega of Japan early in 1995 after his mysterious year-and-a-half gap, wherein Oshima produced no new games for Sega. Of course, I've already said that I believe this is because Oshima was working on Sonic Crackers for the Saturn, and perhaps indirectly on Knuckles Chaotix, after Sonic Crackers was cancelled, though Oshima is not credited for either game except for his character designs. But in April 1995, Naoto Oshima would be reunited with Yuji Naka in Japan under the banner of Sonic Team, which actually took real formal shape at this point with its own logo and with Yuji Naka serving as its de facto leader. I'd also like to point out that Sonic Team's new logo was this very cool graphic of Sonic the Hedgehog's blue head, which really makes me second guess the idea that Yuji Naka was simply tired of doing Sonic games in 1995. I mean, Sonic is right there in the freaking name and logo. Plainly, Naka, Oshima, and notably Takashi Iizuka had all come back together in Japan to do a proper Sonic the Hedgehog game, at least eventually, or else they wouldn't have bothered to take this name officially. But instead of making that next-gen Sonic game implied by this cool logo, Sonic Team's first game was Nights into Dreams, which would officially begin development in April of 1995. And Nights, as you know, is not a Sonic game. But if you recall, Naka left California in the fall of 1994, and for a period of about 6 months, he worked alone, getting used to programming for the Saturn and its tricky twin Hitachi microprocessors. What exactly did Yuji Naka do during that time period? Unless he tells us specifically, we have no way of knowing for sure. However, you can consider the fact that Yuji Naka had historically intended intended Sonic 3 to be 3D, and the fact that he came back to Japan, reuniting with Naoto Oshima and Iizuka, who worked with him on Sonic 3, and the fact that their new venture was called Sonic Team, and Sonic the Hedgehog was their official logo. To me, it seems very likely that during those 6 months of experimentation with the Sega Saturn, that Yuji Naka would have tried, at least tried, to make some kind of functional 3D Sonic game for the Saturn, one that at the very least performed better than the version he likely witnessed at STI in California. The actual results of Naka's 6-month crash course for programming on the Saturn would become the foundation for Nights into Dreams, a game where the player controls a sprite that flies all over the screen in loop-de-loops along a horizontal x-axis that occasionally twists or rotates. It's sort of like riding a roller coaster with an invisible track. According to Naka, his earliest builds of Nights into Dreams allowed for total 3D freedom of movement without being tied to a rail, but the sprite moved so fast in every direction that gameplay was disorienting. I can't help but think that Nights looks and plays suspiciously like an unfinished, semi-broken build of what might have been intended to be a 3D Sonic game. If you've ever seen 3D games being made by amateurs, you may have witnessed how surprisingly easy it is for inexperienced programmers to get a 3D sprite to move in every direction, like a crazed alien mosquito buzzing around in outer space. The hard part is getting that same sprite to behave normally, according to semi-realistic physics. If we were to take Nights into Dreams off of its forced rails, and if it were to be endowed with some kind of gravity, then it looks exactly like it could have been a prototype for a 3D Sonic game, a really shitty one. Is it possible that this could have been the real reason why Yuji Naka refused to allow his Nights into Dreams game engine and level editor to be used for Sonic Extreme? Is it possible that access to the game's raw code might have revealed clues that Naka had made yet another pass at producing a 3D Sonic game, which for whatever reason had to be abandoned and then repurposed? It looks to me like Nights was supposed to recreate that exact same sense of speed and excitement that the original Sonic the Hedgehog brought to the Genesis, but perhaps getting that sense of motion was difficult to realize in true 3D. Nights into Dreams, for instance, does contain these awkward intervals where you control these kids that can walk around on a 3D plane in all directions. These intervals are very short, but they play out a lot more like a conventional 3D platformer, and as you can see, they are extremely awkward. A really bad part of the game, if I'm being honest. Nobody likes this portion of the game, and thus it begs the question as to why these moments were even included. I suspect the reason is simple. This true 3D platforming gameplay, which you'd expect to find in a next-gen sequel to Sonic 3, was what this game was originally supposed to be, because Naka wanted to build a prototype for a true 3D Sonic game. Was this maddening, topsy-turvy gameplay of Nights into Dreams actually intended to be this loopy? Or is this character and this ring-grabbing gameplay merely a clever reskin? Even the main character really just looks like a distorted silhouette of Sonic the Hedgehog. But if Nights into Dreams really did start off as a Sonic game, and I really think that it probably did, then why on earth wasn't it finished and published as the next Sonic the Hedgehog game? Well, as I've said before, given the lagging sales of Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles, and the fact that Sonic never managed to gain much attention in Japan in the first place, it's possible that Sega executives simply didn't want yet another Sonic game on their flagship Japanese console. On the other hand, it's plain to anyone with eyeballs that Yuji Naka himself loves Sonic the Hedgehog, and it's practically unimaginable that Sonic Team wouldn't have at least made a pass at a 3D Sonic game on their first outing as an official game studio, with that name and that logo. Thus, I think it may have been the case that what Naka initially started coding by himself just wasn't quite usable as a Sonic game, and so making the best out of a bad situation, Sonic Team transformed his work into something else, Nights into Dreams. In support of this, I'd like to point out that Nights into Dreams had a pretty tumultuous and difficult development cycle. The game was started in April of 1995, after Naka's 6-month crash course, and it wouldn't be released until July of 1996. That's a year and 9 months from the release of Sonic & Knuckles until the debut of Nights into Dreams, which is a relatively short game even for the time period. In interviews with both Sega Saturn Magazine and Famitsu in 1996, as translated by Shmuplations, Yuji Naka reveals that working with the Sega Saturn was a major challenge, though the new hardware also opened up new possibilities. Naka stated that his recently finished Nights into Dreams game is completely different from what Sonic Team had originally envisioned. He claims originally they wanted to make an appealing 2D action game similar to Sonic the Hedgehog, but decided to utilize 3D graphics, maximizing the potential of the Saturn's twin processors. I think he might be referring to Sonic Crackers here. Yet at other times in other interviews, Naka claims that he set out to create a 3D flying game from the very beginning. In another 1996 interview, the September issue of official Sega Saturn magazine, Naka reiterates his story about wanting to create a 3D loop-de-loop flying game from day one, but he also admits that development was very challenging. Sonic Team began with only 7 staff members working on the project, but as production lingered, they kept adding staff until nearly 30 people were working on the game at one time. In this, I think there is an oblique admission that Sonic Team was struggling with the technical challenges of making Nights into Dreams a 3D reality. When work on the game began in early 1995, Naka was the only programmer on the job. Indeed, Yuji Naka was famous for being something of a lone wolf maverick when it came to programming throughout his early career, unilaterally working wonders on the SG-1000, the Master System, and the Sega Genesis. But the Sega Saturn was an entirely new kind of beast, from a new universe of potential and complexity, and eventually, Nights into Dreams was awash in programmers, working with Yuji Naka to finish the game. On Twitter, Naka claims just 2 other programmers worked on the game, but the official game credits indicate that at least 5 additional programmers also worked on the game, probably added piecemeal over time as Sonic Team pushed toward the finish line. Indeed, I wonder if Yuji Naka himself was actually physically coding the game he started by the end of its development, since it would have been his job to supervise all of these programmers, and from this point in his career, supervise is strictly what Yuji Naka did. Nights into Dreams was Yuji Naka's very last mainstream commercial title that he actually did any real programming for. But then I found this very odd comment made by Naka in an interview with official Sega Saturn magazine in September of 1996. The interviewer asked Naka a very simple, innocuous technical question. They asked, "Does Nights into Dreams use the Saturn's 2D power as well as its 3D capabilities? Can you give us some examples of where this is used in the game?" Naka balks at this. "I don't know, haha. I don't particularly want to talk about Nights from a technical aspect. If you really want to write that kind of article, that's fine with me. But writing about the feelings of Nights would be much better. The average person doesn't understand all of these technical points." This is a very odd response from a lead programmer fresh off of completing his very first Sega Saturn game. I'd think that anyone working intimately with programming on the Saturn would have been thrilled to share these exact kinds of details, or at least just answer the question with a single example, if any such example exists. Maybe Naka really believes that Sega fans reading official Sega Saturn magazine are so glib as to prefer a vague description of how Nights makes players feel. It's nauseous, by the way, the game makes me feel nauseous. But I think a better explanation is that Yuji Naka simply doesn't know the answer to the question, and is obfuscating in order to save face. After nearly 2 years of development, including 6 months of Naka farting around with 3D programming, I think it's likely that Naka was effectively replaced as an actual programmer on Nights in the middle of the game's development, and thus a bunch of Sega personnel were either hired or shuffled around, joining the team in order to finally complete the project. But my real question remains, did Nights into Dreams start off as a Sonic the Hedgehog game? I think so. I have no explanation for why anyone would deliberately make this. Just look at this mess. Is this really the sort of thing people make on purpose? I think Nights into Dreams is a Jackson Pollock of video games, a happy accident that Sega fans have endowed with meaning and artistry that may actually turn out to be little more than a big sloppy mess with an elite fan base. But of course, this is mere speculation. Speculation speculation based upon some compelling evidence, but speculation nonetheless. More recently, data miners have begun to analyze the actual game code for Nights into Dreams on the Saturn. Perhaps this work will reveal clues about why Yuji Naka was so apprehensive about letting STI use his code to make Sonic Extreme. Maybe it was a Sonic game to begin with, or maybe it was just a spectacular, embarrassing mess. Or maybe Yuji Naka just hates Sega of America so much that he was allowed to indirectly sabotage his own company. Or maybe in some way it was all three. Or if we take Yuji Naka at his word, then it was none of the above? But can we take Yuji Naka at his word on this particular issue? Referring back to Naka's controversial Twitter tirade, we're left wondering who is really telling the truth here. Did Yuji Naka really indirectly sabotage the release of Sonic Extreme by denying STI his game code? Or is this just a rumor to deflect blame from what was, no doubt, a complete and total shit show on the part of Sega of America's leadership? On the one hand, it's hard to believe Yuji Naka would have actually been allowed to sabotage Sonic Extreme just because he was the guy that coded Sonic the Hedgehog. At the same time, Naka's claim that he didn't know about Sonic Extreme has to be false, right? Naka worked at STI from 1991 to late 1994, and he would have still been working on Sonic and Knuckles when Sonic Mars was initially pitched at STI. Further, Naka had established ambitions to develop a 3D Sonic game as early as 1993 himself, and it's clear that he took direct inspiration from Sega Sonic, the Sonic the Hedgehog arcade game. Naka is a man who stayed in the loop and paid careful attention to what his cohorts were up to, especially regarding the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. The idea that he wouldn't have known about Sonic Extreme in 1996 is crazy to me, and the fact that he'd be irritated that STI didn't ask his permission kinda gives away what he probably thought of STI making a Sonic game in the first place. There's a good reason Naka, Enoshima, and Iizuka got back together in Japan, and they officially named their new venture Sonic Team. They wanted the world to know who Sonic really belonged to. Old Japanese men. Yes, even today, Sonic belongs to old Japanese men. They legally own the rights to the character, but still, with the formation of Sonic Team, one gets the sense that these guys, especially Naka and Oshima, wanted to carve out a future for themselves as Sonic the Hedgehog's official studio. And guess what? That means they would have been in direct competition with STI in 1996. So the story about Naka blocking STI's access to his code isn't crazy, though Sonic Extreme was always going to suck anyway. Naka was right. Even if STI got the code, they were writing the game in C instead of assembly. Attempting to compile Naka's work into C means the game was going to just play like crap anyway. Nothing was going to help Sonic Extreme reach a Christmas '96 deadline. So that part is not really Naka's fault. There's a lot of stories like this about Yuji Naka on the internet, though these are the most popular. As you can see, Naka is frequently portrayed as a two-faced villain, willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead. But how true are these stories? Could it just be that a lone wolf maverick like Yuji Naka just lacks good interpersonal skills? Is it possible that Naka struggles to make friends as readily as he makes enemies, and thus, in the end, there are just more people willing to bury his legacy? I mean, it could be a little of column A and column B at the same time. Maybe Naka is a two-faced villain, willing to damage other people's careers, at the same time that he was a highly talented lone wolf maverick programmer who struggled to make friends? Whatever the case may be, lots of people have beef with Yuji Naka, and sometimes people get even. In 2022, Yuji Naka made the news when it was reported that he had been arrested in Japan twice. Both times he was charged with insider trading, which occurred during his Balan Wonderland days at Square Enix. Now, this story has been grossly sensationalized because the image of Yuji Naka being arrested or going to jail seems to be a fitting juxtaposition to the catastrophic failure of Balan Wonderland and the apparent end of Naka's career in the game industry. Essentially, it's a dramatic finish to the Yuji Naka story, a story about hubris and a fall from grace. But what's missing from the popular narrative is the fact that insider trading is extremely common in Japan and not really really regarded as a noteworthy criminal offense. Indeed, until fairly recently, insider trading was essentially a misdemeanor, with extremely light fines as a penalty, and the Japanese people, on the whole, don't really view insider trading as a grave moral failing. But this makes Yuji Naka's arrest and subsequent media exposure a bit suspicious to me. Suspicious in the sense that it appears as if someone at Square Enix, or the world at large, has it out for Yuji Naka, and it's not crazy to think that this all might have come as a direct result of Naka's lawsuit against Square Enix in retaliation for firing him. When Naka was arrested for insider trading, it was alongside another Square Enix employee named Taisuke Sasaki. Sasaki, who also appears to have been released by Square Enix, was a technical production associate who worked on games such as Dragon Quest XI and Kingdom Hearts 3, and most recently he received a special thanks credit on Balan Wonderland, implying that he was an associate of Yuji Naka. The accusation was that both men, being employees of Square Enix, got word that a couple of small game companies in Japan had landed lucrative contracts to make high-profile games for Square Enix that were guaranteed to appreciate their respective companies' stock value in the near future, after the news was made public, that is. First was a company called Aiming, which was developing a game called Dragon Quest Tact, a spin-off of a series that might be the most popular in Japanese video game history. Yuji Naka and Taisuke Sasaki, alongside a third acquaintance, bought tens of thousands of shares in Aiming prior to the official announcement of Dragon Quest Tact's development. They did this with the aim of selling their shares after the value started to appreciate, thus making a sizable profit in the process. Soon, Naka and Sasaki would try the same trick on a second company called A-Team, buying a ton of stock in A-Team prior to the announcement that the company would be making Final Fantasy VII: The First Soldier. This is what led to a second arrest and a second charge of insider trading for both men. According to the press, Naka traded roughly $1 million in stock of A-Team after he found out about Final Fantasy VII: The First Soldier, and it's estimated that he profited about $150,000 from his sale of stock in Aiming, though I'm not sure how much he really made in total from this affair. However, as of making this video, both Yuji Naka and Sasaki-san have been sentenced for their crimes by the Japanese government. Many people imagined that this meant Naka would be going to jail, but in fact he was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, suspended for 4 years, and he was fined about $14,000. That is to say, as long as Yuji Naka doesn't get arrested again over the next 4 years, he won't actually be going to jail at all. He's a free man. The same goes for Sasaki, who was also given a suspended sentence and a relatively light fine, because again, insider trading isn't really considered a very serious crime in Japanese society. So we can forget about images like this, or even this. None of that's happening. Yuji Naka isn't going anywhere, but also, sadly, it appears as if Yuji Naka isn't going anywhere. Is this the end of the long, prolific, controversial, and tumultuous career of Yuji Naka, a man once hailed and idolized as the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, back when it was actually still really cool to be a Sonic fan, and Sega was still a household name, synonymous with Nintendo, or even the term video game itself? He was a big player in the big-time world of gaming. Over time, as stories are told and then retold, narratives tend to shift, sometimes under the weight of new factual information, or often simply because preferences and values change over time too. Consequently, old heroes and old legends often do acquire a tarnished image, and sometimes they're rewritten as villains. After leaving Sega in the early 2000s, public opinion about Yuji Naka began to shift noticeably, as old enemies from the game industry felt the liberty to speak about the Sega legend in any way that they preferred, and often the results were not very good for Naka's reputation. Meanwhile, Naka creatively floundered as a video game maker, and like a lot of Japanese legends of the 80s and 90s, he was unable to find a foothold in the contemporary video game market. Meanwhile, Naoto Oshima, Yuji Naka's new enemy and old friend, has gradually come to completely displace Naka's once mythic association with Sega's most beloved IP, and perhaps rightly so. After all, it was Naoto Oshima who actually designed the Sonic the Hedgehog character as a character, and today the world looks forward to the next chapter. Sonic Superstars is the latest 2D style Sonic game on the horizon, and it has a lot of people feeling optimistic about Sonic's future. And who's behind behind this new game? None other than Azrest Studios, the same company founded by Sonic co-creator Naoto Oshima, and the same company that worked with Yuji Naka to create Balan Wonderland. It's incredible how we now find ourselves here. Today it's Naoto Oshima who creates Sonic the Hedgehog, and it's Naoto Oshima who gets the credit. And his game looks decent, it looks fine, but if I'm being honest with myself, I much preferred those legendary days of high adventure in my long since misspent youth, when Sonic the Hedgehog belonged to that lone wolf maverick of coding, Yuji Naka. Is Naka really the bad guy that he seems to be? Not really, no, I don't think so. He's certainly not a bad game developer despite the miserable failure that was Balan Wonderland. He also oversaw the creation of Rodea the Sky Soldier, the good version that was intended for the Wii. And in the Dreamcast days, he was consistently one of Sega's best producers, churning out not just decent Sonic games, but unique classics like Choo Choo Rocket, Phantasy Star Online, and Samba de Amigo. And of course, as an actual programmer, at least before the Sega Saturn, Naka was second to none, working miracles on games like Black Belt, Space Harrier, Phantasy Star, Ghouls and Ghosts, and of course the Sonic the Hedgehog series. For which, most agree, he innovated all of the mechanics that made the game stand apart from the competition, even if he isn't the author of the actual character. And sure, there are a lot of gripes and rumors about Yuji Naka, especially coming from ex-Sega of America employees. But a lot of those stories are baseless and more than a little questionable. For instance, I seriously doubt Yuji Naka actually tried to steal the game code for an unfinished version of Geist Force, a doomed Sega Dreamcast game that even its lead developer acknowledges was woefully incomplete and behind schedule at the time of its cancellation. And Yuji Naka had nothing to do with the fact that Sonic Extreme was such a poorly managed mess at the time of its cancellation in 1996. However, despite his protests, I do think there might actually be something real to the claim that Naka tried to stop Sega of America from getting the Nights into Dreams game code. Issuing an ultimatum and threatening to quit in order to get his way is consistent with Naka's history. After all, it's by doing just that Yuji Naka came to work at STI in the first place. I find it impossible to believe that Yuji Naka wouldn't have known about the game, especially since he worked at STI around the time that Sonic Extreme was started, and he had experience attempting to create a 3D Sonic game himself. Further, I think Naka betrays his true feelings when he complains about STI failing to get his approval for such a project. It's hard for me to believe his version of events on Twitter, and again, I think this might be because Yuji Naka may still have something to hide when it comes to the real origins of Nights into Dreams as a game. Have you ever noticed that Yuji Naka and Sonic Team never made a proper sequel to Nights into Dreams, that is? Me too. And I think there are good reasons for that, mainly because they finally did figure out how to make a 3D Sonic game for the Dreamcast, the thing that they were probably trying to achieve all along. Don't believe me? But it's in the name, Sonic Team. And it's the reason Naka and Oshima got back together in 1995, not Nights. So I have to concede, maybe Yuji Naka isn't always completely honest. I mean, insider trading is technically not an honest way to invest in a company, even if it's barely a crime. And it's pretty clear to me that Yuji Naka made quite a few enemies over the years. And based on his record with Square Enix, it seems like he's fairly temperamental, and lots of people are ready to throw this dude under the bus. Just look at that smug mug and tell me what you feel. You want to be friends with this guy? This legend? This absolute genius? Personally, I'd at least like to meet him, shake his hand, and thank him for the work he did on Phantasy Star. Absolute honesty is a rare trait, especially in the dog-eat-dog world of international corporations like Sega or Square Enix, where everyone clamors to take credit for what works just as much as they pretend not to be at fault for whatever doesn't. For a lot of these guys, that's how they survived. But Naka was always a lot more than that. He really actually did do big things, and Sega wouldn't have been the same without him. He's the real deal. And you know what? He seems like a good father too. And while I'm at it, I'll just add that Balan Wonderland isn't that bad of a game. And maybe Naka has a point about how things went with Azrest, a company that doesn't exactly have the greatest track record when it comes to quality games. So yeah, Naka is no longer the unequivocal creator of Sonic, but we were all a lot better off when he was. Except for Sonic 06 and Shadow the Hedgehog, those were pretty bad. Anyway, that's all. Thanks for watching our absolute absolutely massive retrospective about the career of Yuji Naka and his fall from grace. What do you guys think about Sega's legendary programmer? Is he as bad as the rumors make him sound? Or is he just an easy target for Western developers that failed to ascend to his creative heights? Have you played Balan Wonderland? Please let us know this and more in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Bye bye now.